Well, as John indicated, and as you've seen in the invitation, I'd like to draw some themes from our book, The Self-Transforming School, that was actually launched just less than 10 days ago at the Graduate School of Education at the University of Melbourne. It's just worth a little reflection for a moment on the word transformation, because it's central to the Christian faith. Verse 2 in chapter 12 of Romans makes this clear. Do not conform yourselves to the standards of this world, but let God transform you inwardly by a complete change of your mind. Then you will be able to know the will of God, what is good and is pleasing to Him and is perfect. So, reflecting on that, transformation is an inner experience. And we intend the same sense in the idea of a self-transforming school. The Christian is open to the will of God. The Christian school, the Catholic school, is also open to the will of God, but it's open in other ways. Expressed simply, the self-transforming Catholic school is and must be open to a range of influences, but in a sense it calls the shots in terms of the directions it will take. How it discerns the forces that are shaping society and education generally and their potential impact on the school, and then making choices as far as future directions is concerned. Well, as I said, I would like to draw on the leadership themes in that book, and as John hinted, my co-author is somebody with whom I've worked for many years. In fact, this is our 5th book, and in being commissioned by the publisher to write it, the publisher and we were mindful of the fact that it was exactly 25 years since our first book, which was The Self-Managing School. So we intend in the book to look back over what has happened in the last 25 years. But we would also like to look ahead for the next 25 years. And that's why we suggest that in 2038 we will be in no doubt at all that our schools have been transformed and they've taken charge of the agenda to a substantial extent. Our first book was, when it was released, The Self-Managing School, caused consternation in some circles, particularly among government schools, because it hinted that government schools would become independent schools, or it was privatising public education. But anybody who had read the book would know that it wasn't that. In fact, I do recall in another country not too far from here, academics voted 169-0 against the idea of the self-managing school. So how about that for an encouraging start for two authors? But actually, when you look at the book or read it now, and you don't, because it's just a common sense way of leading and managing a school in terms of setting priorities, working within a framework that is set by the system, tailoring the curriculum to suit the local context, making a budget, setting priorities for the allocation of resources, and then regularly evaluating. And we just happen to include in the book some examples of how that could be done. And that's just common sense, and we take it for granted. And Catholic schools have taken it for granted for decades. My co-author, Jim Spinks, is a former school principal, most of the books that I've written have been with practitioners, and we discovered the work of Jim in a project of national significance in 1983. His school, Rosebery District High School on the remote west coast of Tasmania, was nominated by knowledgeable people as the most effective school in the state, in a general sense and in the way it allocated its resources. And we used that, the practice at that school to provide illustrations in our first book. I should say that it was understandable that if you were principal of a school on the west coast of Tasmania, you would be self-managing. I quickly discovered that central office people hated the long drive to the west coast. But in terms of engaging with the community and doing all the things that I've just outlined, that school provided the model. Now, we didn't then move immediately to publishing that book because we wanted to test the ideas in the real world, so to speak. So Jim and I conducted 52 workshops for 5,000 school principals from 1,200 schools in every part of Victoria. And then we were able to tailor the message to, for publication to an international audience. And in the years following, we were able to conduct programs on exactly the same scale in New Zealand and in England and in Hong Kong. Now, just to move us into the territory of this particular book, 25 years later, The Self-Transforming School, just as we drew the initial evidence from a comprehensive research project and then field tested the ideas, so we have done with this book. So you will find that we've drawn evidence from 11 countries. And we've had our eye on many of those countries for a number of years, haven't we? So from North America, Canada and the United States, from South America, one of the powerhouses of the future, Brazil, then in Europe and Nordic countries, England and Finland, East Asia and Southeast Asia, Shanghai, China, Hong Kong, China, Singapore, and also a potential powerhouse in India. And in the southern hemisphere, again, South Africa, that's got enormous potential, but hasn't yet realised it in a general sense and as far as education is concerned. And of course, Australia and New Zealand. So we're able to draw from first-hand research, quite comprehensive research, in 6 of those countries, but then monitoring developments in the others. The book itself has these chapters, and I will just touch on a couple of features there. You'll see that the foreword to the book is written by Dame Pat Collarbone, who's Director of Creating Tomorrow in England. But we've known Pat for about 20 years. She was principal of Haggerston School for Girls in Hackney in England and absolutely transformed that school. So it became a leading school, and it was for her work at Haggerston that she was the first principal in modern times in England to be recognised as a Dame of the British Empire. And then subsequent to that, Dame Pat headed up a task force that was designed to reform the workplace for teachers and other professionals. She headed up the London Leadership Centre and is now a really highly respected speaker and consultant on the international stage. She was a key influence in developing the national professional standard for principals of the Australian Institute for Teaching and School Leadership, and many of you will have heard Pat before. So there are the chapters of the book, and I'm going to draw from about half of them in this presentation. Now, we are looking ahead for the next 25 years, and you might just ask the question, and I'll come back to it in more detail later, how is it possible to look ahead for 25 years when we don't know what's going to happen next week or next year or the next 5 years? Well, we think you can. We think you can discern right now the megatrends, the big, broad developments in society and in education that are going to shape what we do in our schools for the next 25 years. Now, we haven't come to this as novices because we tried our hand at the same thing in our second book called Leading the Self-Managing School, which was published in 1992. In the preceding 5 years, we'd conducted all of those workshops that I'd mentioned before in countries other than Australia, and we were able to construct a narrative of the forces that were shaping education in different countries. So we tried our hand at, to use the language of the time, to identify 10 megatrends. This is in 1992. We wrote the book in 1991, and it's just worth revisiting those briefly just to see how you could discern what was likely to unfold, and now we can look back and make sense of it. We can put a timeline to what's happened over the last 25 years. So if we have a look at some of those, we suggested there would be a powerful but sharply focused role for central authorities, especially in respect to formulating goals, setting priorities, and building frameworks for accountability. There's no doubt that that's gathered momentum over the last 20 years. And national and global considerations will become increasingly important, especially in respect to curriculum and an education system that is responsive to national needs within a global economy. Or number 4, there will be unparalleled concern for the provision of a quality education for each individual. I mean, we get data about that by the day, internationally, nationally, and at the school level, and the expectations just have been building over 20 years for us to be able to provide evidence that we are in fact responding to the needs of each individual child. I won't go through all 10, but just pick another one like number 5, which of course is shaping the transformation of our school. As we sensed in 1991, there will be a dispersion of the educative function, with telecommunications and computer technology ensuring that much learning that currently occurs in schools, in institutions of higher education, will occur at home and in the workplace. We just take that for granted now, and momentum continues to build. There are some others there that have moved forward, but we've taken a few steps back, I think. Schools are doing remarkable things on number 6, building a capacity for problem solving, creativity, and a capacity for lifelong learning among our students. But I fear that a rather narrow focus on high stakes testing has often sidelined number 7, the arts especially, and spirituality defined broadly. The other 3 are there on the screen, but number 10 would be the only other one that I'd comment on, and that is if you don't work in a school, by golly, you'd better be there to support schools. You're there by way of service. It's a service leadership role if you are not in a school, and that would apply to Greg Whitby and staff in the office and everybody else around the country who is in a position to support schools. And again, we've moved forward, we've moved back, but I just have a feeling that we'll need to heighten the expectation on those who don't work in schools directly to provide support. Now, just before I clarify a couple of ideas, concepts here. We do acknowledge in the book that schools are at different stages of self-transformation. Jim and I have done a fair bit of work in South Africa, and it just doesn't make sense to define transformation in the same way as we would here. At times you're battling to get students to come to school, or battling to get teachers to show up and teach. I've been in another country where I visited a school, a primary school, and there was no learning occurring in any room in the school because no teachers had yet shown up. So when we're talking about transformation there, it's a different connotation to what we'll use. We also acknowledge that if you're going to be a self-transforming school, you have to have an extraordinary capacity for, as a professional, and I'll spell that out as I proceed. And thirdly, this is not in the book, but it's implied throughout. Catholic schools have transformation at the heart of their spirituality. So many of the things that I talk about and will illustrate, you should be very comfortable with them. Just by way of some definitions, very, very quickly, in our original book, Self-Managing School, we said a self-managing school is a school that's got significant authority and responsibility to make decisions about the way it allocates resources, with resources defined very broadly, not just money, but its space, its curriculum, its technology, its staffing, and the like. So a self-managing school has a high level of, but not complete autonomy, given the centrally determined framework within which it must operate. Our Catholic schools, almost by definition, are self-managing schools. The centrally determined framework can be national, can be state. It can have at its heart, of course, a robust set of values that are common to all Catholic schools. Now, that idea of a self-managing school was focusing very much on process. In talking about a self-transforming school, we wanted to shift the idea to an outcome. So there's our definition. A self-transforming school achieves or is well on its way to achieving significant, systematic and sustained change that secures success for all students in all settings. And we intend that most literally. Success for all students in all settings, whether it is the most remote school serving only Indigenous students, or whether it's a school that is specialising in a particular area, such as music, or technology, or science, or mathematics. The aim is securing success for all students in all settings. It's actually an outcome that hasn't been achieved for all students in all settings in history. So it's reasonable to say we're on a transformation journey. But as we show in the book, we've drawn ideas from so many schools here in Australia and in other countries that we believe it is possible, because some schools are self-transforming under the most challenging of circumstances. There are a couple of other ideas that are floating around at the moment. For example, David Hargraves has written a very thoughtful set of think pieces for the National College of School Leadership in England, and he refers to a self-improving school system and a self-improving school, and he considers that a capacity for self-management is a prerequisite. But now, David produces a very sharp edge to his writing about a self-improving school system, which I've quoted here, that if you've got a self-improving school system, it will reduce the need for extensive top top-down systems of monitoring to check on school quality, the imposition of improvement strategies that are relatively insensitive to local context, with out-of-school courses not tailored to individual professional needs, and external last-ditch interventions to remedy schools in difficulties, all of which are very costly, soak up resources, which would be better placed if capacities for self-improvement had been developed in the school to enable it to be even better and to be transforming. Now that's a pretty sort of hard edge to the idea, and I'll come back to it. But again, just moving backwards and forwards from more general writing to writing that is specific as far as Catholic schools are concerned. A self-managing school, indeed a self-transforming school, is perfectly consistent with a principle which lies at the heart of Catholic practice around the world, and that's the principle of subsidiarity. And I've quoted there at length but won't read, but in the expanded version of the paper that will be made available after the lecture, you can read it. But it's essentially this, that you shouldn't be taking on at a higher level something that a lower level is perfectly capable of doing itself. The implication is that we should build a capacity in every school to be self-transforming. And I was very taken with a book written by the former CEO of Catholic education in the Sandhurst Diocese in Victoria, Dennis Higgins, and Dennis will be known to some of you. His book Lodestones, which is really autobiographical in terms of his broader experience in life and in Catholic schools, he says no system should talk of self-managed schools. And he says we should shift the notion to self-led schools. And the system can do its schools its greatest favours by encouraging and enabling local school settings to take responsibility for all of the big decisions and to help out by providing the resources and support for that to happen. And that really captures very much, and we cite it in the book, of the situation as far as leadership is concerned in schools. Now, something that is proving a little contentious, but it didn't constrain us in describing it in detail in the book, is that we believe, again judging from what schools that are excellent in self-transformation are doing now in this country and other countries, we believe that schools are excessively chained. And so we talk about chaining the self-managing school. And we have this little diagram here which captures the intent. If you just look down the left-hand side there, schools vary in terms of how much autonomy they have. It can be either high or low. Schools vary in terms of how much control is exercised over their operations. It can either be high or low. And schools vary in terms of their outlook. Some schools are very inward-facing. Others are outward-facing, even to the extent of seeing themselves as a global community of schools. And a school can be relatively closed or relatively open. And there are 8 possible combinations of high and low and open and closed, as you can see there. And it's appropriate for schools to have low autonomy, high control, and to be closed outlook under some circumstances. I won't go through those, and I hinted at some before. But most schools in Australia are of that type 5 and 6, where relatively high degree of autonomy, relatively high. It varies around the country and among systems. But there's a relatively high degree of control, we argue, over what schools are doing. And some schools are still relatively closed and others are very open in their outlook. And so the notion of schools being chained excessively, we put in the book. And we think it is time that we, for most schools, unchain them so that they can move to the right, have relatively high degrees of autonomy, relatively low degrees of control, and be preferably over there in category 8, very open in their outlook in terms of what's happening in society and in education, and what's happening locally, nationally, and internationally. And many of your schools will be in 7 and 8 categories, and 8 right now, because we refer to them in the book. Or to reconstitute that figure with a couple of pretty tough descriptors there, we think it's time to move from self-management to self-transformation, moving away from low autonomy, because we believe that there's too many of our change strategies affecting schools around the country are very much command and control type strategies. So, that's just a reflection on the present situation. Also, a reflection on the present situation, which we cite in the book, would be this, in terms of our national performance on international tests of student achievement, the Program for International Student Assessment, the findings of which dominate our newspapers for a day or two in December, and then they disappear until the next year. But the OECD analysis in 2011 was telling us that for 15-year-olds, on average, Australian students were, in mathematics, 12 months behind Hong Kong, 25 months behind Shanghai, and 14 months behind Singapore. I mean, that is very worrying. And you've read the headlines for these and other tests as well. Not nearly as daunting as the challenge faced by the United States over there at the right, where 15-year-olds there are on average 33 months behind the average performance of students in Shanghai. So that's the challenge that is facing us. Now, this part is not for the faint-hearted. Some of you just might have caught sight of the letter that I wrote to the incoming Prime Minister that was published in the Sydney Morning Herald about 2 weeks ago. We actually run the argument in the book, but we've referred internationally, and we're saying that, look, there really is a strong case for change in Australia and in the handful of other countries where the federal role in education is constraining schools, for good and for bad, as well as the states controlling, for good or for bad, what is happening in schools. Now, we're just saying that it's time that we follow the lead of countries like Canada, a country that I know well. I lived and worked there for 13 years, but it is an international exemplar in its own right. Canada, population about 50% larger than Australia. It's just as multicultural as Australia. It has the same proportion, probably a little higher, of Indigenous or First Nation students. But it outperforms Australia on all the international tests of student achievement. And its federal government has no role in school education, except for people who are in prison or children who are Indigenous, First Nation students, or for children in the highly mobile armed forces. In Canada, they've operated since their constitution was established with a council of ministers of the provinces and territories. And they've got on perfectly well without, because the Constitution forbids it, as I said, a role for the federal government in school education, with the exceptions that I've mentioned. Now, it is timely, we argue, but we sort of ratcheted up the argument a little bit in the newspaper article to say, look, we've got to do something dramatically different, and we'd put it in the context of empowering schools, because we've flatlined in NAPLAN, or gone backwards. We've gone backwards in PISA and TIMSS and PIRLS and just about every other international indicator. And so we, like the United States, have a federal government that is determined to implement what's effectively a command and control approach at the same time as the states have. And we just say there's no need for them. I'm seeing an unprecedented amount of writing in the United States at the moment about their federal government ought to get out of the business of command and control approaches in school education, and we say it is the same in Australia. But as you saw in the article, if you had a chance to read it, we say to the incoming Prime Minister, please do not appoint a Minister for School Education, but give us the money. So, we've got ACARA that's has set up a national curriculum, Australian Curriculum Assessment and Reporting Authority. We've got the Australian Institute of Teaching and School Leadership, which has got a fine set of professional standards and other frameworks. Why not a third agency owned by the states and territories called a School Funding Authority that operates continuously with a board of directors that would include a director from Catholic education, independent schools, so that we don't have to go through what we have been going through for many years now, but acutely in the last few months, of what effectively is, if you read the media releases, bullying of states and territories and school systems. Mind you, the premiers have often given back as good as they've got. Now, I'm mindful of the fact that in terms of Gonski, I'm in New South Wales and you were the first state to sign up, and Catholic education has signed up. But it's a situation that we argue, if you're going to have self-transforming schools, we don't need, viewing it from the perspective of a principal or a teacher, two levels of government competing against one another to tell schools what to do. We just quote there, we don't quote it, but it's interesting that in Canada you have competition among the provinces there. In terms of the original concept of self-management, it actually tracks back to the Carmel report and the Whitlam government's initiative in devolution of authority and responsibility to schools, in which Catholic education had a very powerful voice in the formulation of that. We would just say that if you actually look back in the intervening years since 1973, almost all of the innovations that I can think of were at the initiative of individual schools, individual school systems, states and territories. In Victoria, that took a big leap forward with more autonomy for its schools in the early 1990s, it did so of its own volition. There's a wonderful PhD thesis by Barbara Hinds at the University of Melbourne, who interviewed every person who was involved in that initiative of giving schools more authority and responsibility, and none of the key stakeholders, from the minister down through the Education Department and others, could not recall a single telephone call, a single memo or a single letter from the federal government saying it could or could not do what it had done. And that's a pretty sobering piece of writing that was rather influential in us making that first recommendation, and that led to the article, but also the second bullet point point there. Now, that's sort of looking at the present, looking back over the past 25 years. What about leadership for the self-transforming school for the next 25 years? And I've got 4 areas, and I'm going to touch in particular on the first of them. And I'd like to come back to a point that I made very, very briefly at the start when I said that if we're looking ahead for the next 25 years, it's not possible to specify the particularities of changes. We can't say how big a development will be at a particular point in time. We can't talk about the sequence. But it is possible to provide a framework to describe the domains in which change is likely to occur. And in the book we suggest and illustrate, including illustrations from schools, development in the domains of leadership in those 4 areas. As I did at the start, it's worth actually reflecting on looking ahead in biblical terms, as I did at the start, because Christianity is a very prophetic religion. It seems to me in biblical terms that the prophet was one who was able to understand the flow from past to present to future. And we believe it's possible for school leaders to also understand the flow from past to present to future. In a commentary in the Illustrated Bible Dictionary, the author on prophecy used the example of Moses. Yahweh sent Moses into Egypt, possessed of the clues necessary to interpret the great events that were to follow. Possessed of the clues necessary to interpret the great events that were to follow. And that author notes that prediction seems to belong to the very idea of the prophetic office. So the detail and the scope and the sequence and the way it was written up really only emerges after events occurred, when we know the lapse of time. So we'll be able to develop the detailed history in 2038, but now the challenge is to, following the commentary on Moses, to pick up the clues necessary to interpret the great events that are now unfolding and will continue to unfold in the years ahead. Now, just to give illustrations for a few minutes, I've chosen the first of those for more detailed exposition here. We were very taken by a book by Milton Chen, who describes 6 what he calls leading edges in learning. Chen has a long history associated with learning. He worked initially on the Sesame Street workshops in the early 1960s, but in more recent years has moved out of that to look more broadly at learning, and his book, which the extended version of this presentation references, is actually worth getting. I won't go through them in detail, but he suggests that if you look at what is now happening, the clues necessary to interpret what is happening and what will unfold, the clues lie in changes on those 6 dimensions. It's very hard to capture these on a single slide, but he's saying that more and more we're moving away from it's either this approach to learning or that, but it's a combination. We've got to broaden our mindset in that regard. Or the curriculum edge represents the growing trend of transforming and reorganising the most fundamental educational activities, what students are taught and how their learning is assessed. the technology edge. Until every student has his or her own computer, the benefits of using them on a regular, ongoing basis are undercut. And many schools, including a school that I was at yesterday in Mildura in northwest Victoria, every student had, at the primary level, a computer. I saw students in the prep grade, prior to grade 1, for a part of their learning using an iPad or equivalent. And I spent a fair bit of time with one of those students to satisfy myself that this was genuine learning, that it was educational, and that it was also fun and entertaining, and it was. Time, place, edge, the destruction of the old view of education happening within the four walls of the classroom. I won't touch on the others, but they are self-explanatory as you look at them. Now it seems to us, and we illustrate it in the book, that it is possible for every school to map where it is at on 6 continua represented by those 6 leading edges. So you can make a continuum for each case. So in terms of technology, the school may have few students or even teachers empowered with technology, or at the right-hand end there might be many empowered. Or in terms of time and place, the learning might be essentially time, place bound. Or it could be any time, any place learning for some things. So it's possible for a school to map where it's at, as has been done here, just in a hypothetical mapping, or in a second one there. Now, what the map should be, if there is possible to place a value on it, is likely to vary according to the stage of learning, of course. And any time, any place learning, while it is occurring at all stages of learning, may be more evident at the senior levels. But the point that we simply make is this, that these are almost certainly the clues to what is likely to unfold and is already unfolding in many schools. We'd recommend that. We've worked with some schools and using that as the starting point for discussions about where the school will go, should go, might go, so on and so forth. So that's, we find that a particularly powerful way to organise the clues as we interpret the events that are occurring and will unfold in the years ahead. Now, what about what some people probably improperly call traditional approaches to learning? I noticed some good writing about this in newspapers as well as in practitioner and academic journals. I mean, what about direct instruction, explicit teaching? Now that fits into the category that Chen would refer to as the either or. It's not either or. It's not learning on those dimensions and nothing else. Where's direct instruction or explicit learning fit in? So here I refer to one of your previous Anne D. Clark lecturers, John Hattie, who first of all gives us a nice little definition of direct instruction. The teacher decides the learning intentions and success criteria, makes them transparent to the students, demonstrates them by modelling, evaluates if they understand what they've been told by checking for understanding, and retelling them what they've been told by tying it all together with closure. That's Hattie's definition. Now that can occur and should occur in any mode. In the mapping that we've built from Chen's work, it's not either or. And it's very clear if one visits schools in some of those countries that are outperforming us, as well as those schools that are doing exceedingly well at present, that there's a lot of direct instruction, and there should be. Now, Hattie goes on to say in his book, and we're quoting here from Visible Learning, and you sense the frustration in John's statement here. Every year I present lectures to teacher education students and find they are already indoctrinated with the mantra, constructivism good, direct instruction bad. And when I show them the results of these meta-analyses, they are stunned and they often become angry at having been given an agreed set of truths and commandments against direct instruction. And John, as he does in a way that no other academic has been able to do, as he identifies 136 different factors that can influence learning from the 800 meta-analyses that he drew on in Visible Learning, says, let's look at the evidence. And the evidence is this. Quoting directly again from the book, the direct instruction model where participating students near or at national norms in math and language and close to national norms in reading, students in the other 8 approaches, discovery learning, language experience, developmentally appropriate practices and open education often, not always, perform worse than the control group, that is, receive direct instruction. And that poor performance came in spite of tens of thousands of additional dollars provided for each classroom each year. So John is not saying it's one or the other, it's both, but there's powerful evidence about this approach to learning. But as we've suggested, if we look at the clues to enable us to see where we are going and where we will go and where we should go, we see some really exciting developments on those 6 dimensions that I mentioned before. We include in the book one example, which was one of the most extraordinary examples I've seen in recent times. It's from Ballajura Primary School in Western Australia, that in the last iteration of NAPLAN outperformed like schools on every single indicator at year 3 and 5. Every one of them. And it's gone from near the bottom to near the top, to the top, better, significantly better than like schools in 3 years. And that had been, as we explain in the book, quoting the principle, because of a sharper focus on explicit teaching, direct instruction, but without giving way on the use of technologies and the other elements on the 6 dimensions of 10. Also, that school, which is located in just under the average of the socio-economic index of educational advantage, was able to keep breadth in curriculum in terms of the arts defined broadly. So it had not been constrained by what some people would see as being these restrictive effects of high-stakes testing. So, but there are lots of other examples as well. Implications for policy and practice. So we would suggest that the leading edges that are going to come together to enable transformation have been identified, and schools can make plans accordingly if you are not already doing so, even though the details may not be known in the short term. The next point there that we make is that we're probably likely to see schools, as we are for some schools now, moving to a global curriculum beyond a national curriculum, although they can tick the boxes on the national curriculum as adapted in New South Wales or to your local setting. My friend and colleague, the late Hedley Bear, was alert to this as the Australian curriculum was being developed. He was saying, look, this is long overdue to have a national curriculum. We've been trying for 20 years. It's great, said Headley. But he says it's almost certain that our best schools will move beyond that to a global curriculum. And many schools are doing that, at least in terms of learning the way students learn. The school that I mentioned in regional Victoria regularly conducts classes or learning activities with students in Canada in a primary school that they've twinned up with. Many of your schools have done the same, so I'm not saying anything new here. But of course it's fascinating when they learn here in summer and the students there are knee-deep in snow around. But that's what's occurring. So we can be confident, I think, that the self-transforming school and leading the self-transforming school will involve a journey along that path for a local curriculum, but is really, the school is so outward facing that it is also a global curriculum. So let's move towards wrapping this up now. Our third last chapter is called The Knowledge. The Knowledge. And we've probably obviously taken that title of the chapter from the knowledge that has to be mastered by London taxi drivers, whom I'm assured still have to learn 320 routes and the location of 25,000 streets and 20,000 landmarks before they get their licence, and that will take them 3 years, even though they've got sat navs in their cars, GPS systems. And we don't intend to force the analogy, but we just say, like if London taxi drivers have to memorise all of these things, surely we as professionals can master very significant amounts of knowledge that is robust knowledge and tested knowledge and thoroughly evidence-based knowledge. And so we use the example of John Hattie's visible learning and 136 factors, as he's developed it further in visible learning for teachers in another book which he's about to release that he did not give me the title of. He chaired the launch of our book a couple of weeks ago. But of course, for us in schools, the landmarks keep changing, don't they? And the streets keep changing. The makeup of our schools keep changing. Populations, the demographic makeup of our schools can change within months. So the challenge for us in school education is how do we acquire the knowledge in the first place and then keep up to date with the knowledge. Major implications for teacher education, which I won't go into, but especially for professional knowledge as we go through our careers, and professional knowledge in particular in the context of this lecture for leaders. So we suggest here is the core of professional knowledge for leaders. Understanding the story of where we've come from. So this is sort of the biblical view of being able to discern the clues from watching where we've come from, what we're doing now, where we're going. There. So for us it was to construct a narrative for self-management. Actually it wasn't, we didn't go back to 1988, we actually went back in Australia to the Carmel report that recommended devolution, that many states took up and some didn't. So being able to tell the story of where we've come from. And Catholic schools are great leaders. You are in terms of telling stories, not only about the school itself and the faith and the saints and others, but the narrative of how we're moving in education is also important, and the journey to self-transformation. And that calls on us to understand trends and megatrends in society and the economy. We shouldn't shy away from understanding what's happening in the economy and what ought to happen, because education, society and economy have always been almost an integrated, overlapping set. And if we don't respond to societal needs and the needs of the economy, our schools and our nation will fall by the wayside. Strategically navigating. We like that term. You may still work with strategic plans, but fortunately they're no longer 50 pages in length. They should only be 3 or 4, but we prefer the idea of strategically navigating, maybe as Moses did, discerning the clues and then making some predictions about broad trends that will make sense when we get to some point in the future. But we also need to be innovative, understanding the relationship between innovation, reform and change. Reform may not be innovation, and not all change is innovation, and not all change is reform. We do commend the 6 leading edges of practice that I identified before. And being able to develop not an either or, but a blend, even to adopt the language of blended learning, for which there's a conference in Sydney pretty soon, isn't there? Just a postscript, but I was able to slip it into the extended paper. The best book I've read so far this year in education, which is downloadable from Kindle for $15.99, is this one by Amanda Ripley, The Smartest Kids in the World and How They Got That Way. Amanda Ripley is a journalist with Time magazine, but for 3 years she shadowed international students, or students who were on international exchange programs, who spent time in Finland, South Korea and Poland. So it's all through the eyes of students. In fact, in the final part of the book, she urges us to do even more of this, looking at experiences through the eyes of students. As I was reading the book, I was particularly attracted to, and I don't think we have yet done justice to what is occurring in Finland. I was decidedly unattracted to what occurs in South Korea, where students are still at their coaching schools until after midnight and have to show up to school by 8 or 9 o'clock the next day. And one of the most popular products that students buy is a pillow that they can fasten to their wrists, that they can go to sleep on during their class time in school the next day. And Poland has been moving very fast up the table of the league table of international schools. Let me just quote from the Economist's review of that book. So the commentary refers to the American teenagers who were foreign exchange students. Their wide-eyed observations make for compelling reading. In each country, the Americans are startled by how hard their new peers work and how seriously they take their studies. Maths classes tended to be more sophisticated, with lessons that show the often fascinating ways that geometry, trigonometry and calculus work together in the real world. Students forego calculators, having learned how to manipulate numbers in their heads. Classrooms tend to be understated, free of the high-tech gadgetry of their schools back home. And teachers in every subject exhibit the authority of professionals held in high regard. There's a lot to discuss there, isn't there, in the light of some of the observations that I've made. For those of you who have been in a Finland school will be familiar with this observation that Ripley makes in her book, that's related to the fact that in Finland they do not allow a student to fall behind by more than 48 hours. It's one of the reasons why the gap between high and low performing students is so narrow in Finland. But she has this imagery. In Finland, all kids had to learn. To make this possible, Finland's education system funneled money towards kids who needed help. As soon as young kids showed signs of slipping, teachers descended upon them like a pit crew before they fell behind. About a third of kids, and she overuses that word, I must say, got special help during their first 9 years of school. That's what they mean by special education in Finland. But this imagery of teachers descending on students who show signs of slipping like a pit crew, it appealed to my co-author, who has an enthusiasm for auto racing and automobiles in general. But Jim has visited, as some of you will have had, classrooms in Finland. And Jim describes graphically a situation where he and his wife Marilyn were in a staff room to observe a group of teachers who had paging devices in front of them, and every now and then a pager would go off, and a couple of teachers would head off to a classroom to provide small group or individual attention to a student right there and there in a classroom to help them understand a concept or something. But that help can occur before or after school. %14 of teachers in Finland do not have a class and provide support in that fashion. Now that's a goal that's worth aspiring to, isn't it? Now, just to conclude, the scope and the speed of change is indeed quite remarkable. And you ask, how can we look ahead 25 years when it's difficult to cope with the present, even if we can make sense of where we've come in the past? Well, I've suggested we can because there are clues around that will help us do that. But a nice illustration, which you have probably seen because it's been downloaded off the internet many times, that relates specifically to Catholic schools, would be this photograph. I assume it's a true photograph, or two photographs actually, and many of you will recognise it. So one photograph at the top taken in 2005 when Benedict was announced as the Pope. And a photograph taken this year from exactly the same position when Francis was announced as the Pope. And we say no more in terms of the technology that was in use. Who's seen that before, by the way? Yeah. I just have to discern the time that I should stop using this slide. But it's a good one because it makes the point, and it makes the point for us in this context. So some good news and bad news comes from the management guru, Peter Drucker, who wrote in his book Post-Capitalist Society in 1993. The good news is that these transformations take time, notwithstanding the last slide and the speed of change. And his often quoted first paragraph of his book. So within a few short decades, our worldview, our basic values, our social and political structures, our arts, its key institutions change. And 50 years later, there is a new world. And we are currently living through such a transformation. He was writing in 1993 and writing generally. And we're suggesting the same, and it was just a happy coincidence that we chose for the book a 50-year time frame. We know that a transformation is occurring. We know about the speed of change. We know how far we've come since 1988 in the case of our authors. We know how far we've come since Seymour Papert wrote his book The Children's Machine less than 20 years ago. But we will be able to say, I think with 100% certainty in 2038, that our education system has truly been transformed. Now that's reassuring, isn't it? 50 years, we can breathe a sigh of relief. But he also makes the observation in the same book, as you can see on the right-hand side there, that the institution that faces the greatest challenge of all is the school. But the good news, and the thing that excited us about the book, and why we intend the book to be a positive and uplifting guide to where we've come from, where we're going, is that we are responding to Peter Drucker's challenge in the case of school education. We are. There are remarkable things happening in Catholic schools in this diocese, because I read about them and elsewhere around the country. We quote in the book a vision for the self-transforming school from a couple of other authors whose work we liked. A transformed school will not look like that brick building set apart from society is intended to serve. A transformed school will be an integrated part of the community, and its students will be active participants and contributors to the community. In short, a transformed school will look more like life. And we hold to that. We think it's a worthy vision. I think it's made even richer for the Catholic school, where life includes an inner life and where transformation is an inner experience for the individual, and it's a challenge and an opportunity for the school and its leaders. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brian. Look, we've got the chance for some questions from you, the audience now. Why don't we take 30 seconds to just buzz with the person next to you to see if you could surface what that question might be as our three people with roving mics move to position. 30 seconds.
Good evening, Professor. Jeanette Black from St Madeleine's School at Kenthurst. I'm interested in your comments earlier on about the megatrends for the next 25 years. You alluded to the role of the creative arts and creativity in education. I'd like your comments about how the creative arts and the role of creativity can be used to improve the learning outcomes across all key learning areas.
Wow, that question was certainly worth waiting for, Jeanette. Because I can refer very, very briefly to the findings in our book that we published last year, Transforming Education Through the Arts, that I co-authored with my colleague, Tanya Vaughan. That was based on research in Western Sydney, where in primary schools we were able to get almost an experimental design in our research, very rare in education, where we were able to take 5 schools where upper primary school students were engaged in the arts, broadly defined, music, dance, singing, visual arts, drama, and we were able to match those schools with 5 schools in the same communities, same socioeconomic mix, but where there was no engagement in the arts. And the commissioning organisation, the Song Room, asked us if we'd conduct the research. We didn't expect to find a difference, even though we were monitoring over actually certain outcomes over 18 months, because the students engaged in the arts were only involved for 1 hour a week. And we were astonished to find that attendance on the day when the arts programs were offered was 25% more, higher than in the corresponding or matching set of students in the other schools. And the students in the schools that were engaged in the arts gained a whole year in NAPLAN literacy scores. And on every dimension of social and emotional well-being in the ACER survey instrument on social and emotional well-being, the students who were engaged in the arts had higher levels of social and emotional well-being on every dimension compared to a matching set of students in schools that weren't engaged in the arts. Now, these are astonishing findings. They're not if you know the international literature, which has been around for a while. And we just thought to ourselves, as we say in the book, think of the millions we've been spending on trying to improve literacy with a flatlining across the nation. Why not invest the same amount in a program in the arts, broadly defined? And the good news is that these findings and some promises have been made and allocations have already made in federal and state budgets in that area. So there was a spillover too in state tests in science and mathematics. We had parallel sets of findings from schools that we were monitoring in England. We were looking at social rates of return on investment in the arts that had been conducted in England by PricewaterhouseCoopers. We could see the billions of pounds that were being added to the economy through engagement of students in the arts, how their graduation rates through secondary school increased through engagement in the arts. Now, if you're involved, it's stating the obvious. That's what we found. Good book, Transforming Education Through the Arts.
Good evening, Brian. My name is Yvette Baird from Sacred Heart, Westmead. To achieve the vision that you shared with us at the end of your address, what challenges do you see facing us in the next 25 years in achieving a self-transforming school, apart from removing government controls?
Yeah, just on the last point, you would have seen from that letter that the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age kindly published, or foolishly published, I think. We were saying that we're just simply saying that the federal government could step out of that direct role with a ministry and the great apparatus of thousands of people it employed. The funds should go, as far as possible, directly to schools. And we did acknowledge that it might take a term or two of federal government to design that and to actually implement it. I think the biggest challenge is to build the capacity of the profession. Now, I think I say this as a former Dean of Education at the University of Melbourne, and I was also Dean at the University of Tasmania. I did a review of teacher education for Queensland. I evaluated a faculty of education at the University of Auckland when John Hattie and Viviane Robinson were both professors there. That was daunting, I can tell you. I'm currently evaluating a faculty of education at a university in Victoria. We've barely touched the surface in transforming initial teacher education. We have all good intentions, but we haven't yet seen that transformation more than in one or two examples. Now, I know it's become a cliche, but read Amanda Ripley's book if you are still not convinced about initial teacher education in Finland. Or Pasi Sahlberg's book on Finnish lessons, who spells it out, but not quite in the same engaging detail. I won't go any further on that. But also in our professional development. I noticed you're all signing up the sheets out there for PD credit of some kind or another. So whether or not this particular lecture satisfies your professional needs or has added anything, I'm not sure. It's not a good mode in many ways. We're involved in a project for the Australian Institute for Teaching and School Leadership at the moment, AITL, on innovative approaches to professional learning and also to use of the AITL's performance and development framework. And we're looking at 16 schools and professional associations, and it's astonishing to see some schools, often by themselves, but also in partnership with other schools, actually seriously tailoring the professional learning. There's one school that's on my list of schools that I'm visiting and acting as a critical friend for, where the school is a real top performer on NAPLAN, if you're interested in those indicators. But the staff themselves organise their own professional learning on an any time, any place, any time basis, but the expertise is from within the staff. They still have the occasional traditional stand and deliver kind of professional development, but the amount of professional learning has increased nearly fivefold since they have adopted this, where every teacher is expected to deliver some kind of professional learning on 3 occasions per year, and graduate teachers who have just joined the school once a year. In the last, since they've started this a few months ago, they've had 36 discrete professional learning activities that have been teacher-generated to respond to needs and interests of teachers. Previously, it was, in the same period of time in the preceding months, it was only 8. So I think that's really the key thing here is professional capacity. Yes, I could go into others, but I think that's the key one.
Thank you, Brian. Last question here. Thank you, in the middle.
Thanks. Just an observation and a question. The observation, just supporting your point about the federal-state part. I was always amused when I look at the federal constitution that the word education is literally not mentioned once in it, yet they take a control that doesn't seem to have been envisaged that the founding fathers had for them to take control of. The question is about your point about the flatlining of NAPLAN results. It just occurs to me, and I wonder what you think. Is there any sense in which the flatlining may be happening because of our very obsession with it, and that in an obsession with improving the results, the focus becomes entirely driven by focusing on lifting those results at the expense of a more imaginative approach to teaching, possibly?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to give a definitive answer to that. I've tended in some public comment to be highly critical of NAPLAN, but it's not NAPLAN per se or testing per se. It's just this fact that we, almost alone among countries in the world, are testing every single student every year. I mean, little guys in grade 3 have to show up and do these tests. If you tried that in Finland, there would be a revolt. The profession wouldn't administer them anyway, and parents would wonder why on earth you were doing this. There they test every now and then, every year, a sample of students just to monitor the educational health of the nation. But what they've done there is so trained and upskilled their teachers so that every teacher can test well. Many of these sort of command and control approaches are necessary in the eyes of government because we have, to some extent, lacked the capacity to do certain things at the school level. And that was the point that David Hargraves was making with self-improving school systems and self-improving schools. The more you build the capacity of schools to be self-improving, or we'd say raise it higher, self-transforming, the less you need these things. And those teachers in Finland have been trained to test well. So we are, I think, one of the few countries in the world that insist on every student every year. Gosh, there was a problem when we did the evaluation of teacher education in Queensland, where every university was told not to send its student teachers to schools in the months before NAPLAN, because we didn't want our classes messed up and we're preparing our kids for the test. And how dysfunctional is that? So, I would say, there's a place for national tests. Move to a sample and let's get there by within 5 years would be what I'd advocate. Otherwise, we will see this phenomenon of narrowing the curriculum, which apparently has occurred in many places.
Well,